All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And I have a very special guest today who's returning to talk about their new book, The Soul of Nature on the Unconscious and Related Matters. But we will also be talking about another figure that's extremely important to their career, Carl Jung. And so today I have Dr. Sean J. McGrath, who is a full professor of philosophy at Memorial University of Newfoundland and a specialist in the philosophy of religion and the history of philosophy. McGrath has published and lectured widely in German idealism, phenomenology, ecology, theology, and psychoanalysis. We're kind of traveling through Dr. McGrath's career in this discussion, so I have some of his books here. Hopefully, we could see them. First one is The Early Heidegger and Medieval Philosophy, Phenomenology for the God-Forsaken. I read this. It's a fantastic text. Loved it, actually. Of course, the author of The Dark Ground of Spirit, Schelling and the Unconscious. This is the text that actually made me get into Dr. McGrath's work. This is highly recommended for all reading. I have this book here, The Philosophical Foundations of the Late Schelling and the Turn to the Positive. Really great book, fantastic for the late Schelling scholarship. And one of the texts that I absolutely love, Political Eschatology. I think this is you coming to your voice as a theologian. Now, I know you've done theology throughout your philosophical career. You've always had a kind of interest in the philosophy of religion, but I really think this is you being a theologian, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you for that. It is really my most theological book, so you've read it very carefully. Yeah, I've struggled with the philosophy theology thing, as other people who do both fields do, uh, because of the various ways in which we compartmentalize them in our contemporary academic world. There's different solutions to this, and I think when I started out, I was more inclined to a kind of recur approach, which was to keep them quite separate. So speak theologically in one text and then philosophically in another, but don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. And as I get older, I'm finding that to be a somewhat artificial approach. And I think it also it imports certain assumptions about what philosophy is and what theology is that I don't share and that I never did. It concedes far too much to the culture. So I think in the work that I'm going to be doing going forward, it's going to be much less clear whether it's a contribution to theology or philosophy, because it might actually be both at the same time.
I think what you really do nicely, this political eschatology text, and I highly recommend um, all of the viewers to buy and check it out. It's not only a work of Dr. Sean McGrath, but I think it's one of the first works of philosophical religion in the Schellingian sense, if that makes any sense. I think you have this really nice reading that this is not a left reading, this is not a right reading, this is Schelling in the future world, right? The
Mhm.
Johannine church in that sense. I think
Yes,
you do a really nice way of presenting that towards the last chapters of the book.
thanks for that. I think I was probably aiming at that. Philosophical religion, a disputed concept, but one of the things I think everybody pretty much agrees on is that it means somehow that a religious content which was in another age it received as something external and perhaps even controversial or threatening to philosophy becomes so internalized because of history, because of cultural evolution. It becomes so internalized that it really is now properly philosophical. And Schelling thinks that's a time to come in the future. But maybe that's the position that I'm trying to reach towards with regard to suspending the distinction between philosophy and theology, at least in some contexts. And in the context of that book, it was on ecology, on environmental ethics, on environmental policy. particularly writing for a post-Christian community. If I was writing for, let's say, a Japanese community, I probably would have written, oh, I couldn't have, but I would expect a different book for such a community. And this might get into what we're going to talk about today, that I've become much more convinced that there are historical communities whose thought and expression are rooted in shared symbols which cannot simply be uprooted, or they can be critically engaged, they should be, but there will be some way in which basic presuppositions, as Collingwood calls it, will be operative. And these basic presuppositions are not going to be, universal human presuppositions. They'll be culturally specific for historical communities that are plural, composed of believers, non-believers, conservatives and progressives, critics and enthusiasts. But they will all of this plurality will remain somehow rooted in a common symbolic base. And my base is Christian, but it's also the base of many of my atheist friends. And we are all working with this common symbolic base. That allows the theologian to be much freer with his or her expression. And it also equalizes things, so that just as the secular atheist humanist voice has a right to the floor, so to speak, so does the theological voice, even if it's becoming a minority voice.
I think one of the consistent or common threads that I like in your thought, and it is this, it is a kind of philosophical Christianity thinking through ecology, and it starts in thinking nature, starts with that book, right into your political eschatology text. So I think that you really do have a kind of unique ground um, and voice right now for the time in this whatever era that we're living in, an era of complete chaos, of turmoil. I've always been interested in why Carl Jung for you. So who is this figure, Carl Jung, to you, and why do you think he remains important?
So everybody knows who Carl Jung is, just like everybody knows who Sigmund Freud is, and everybody knows who Santa Claus is. So we don't really need to introduce him uh, as a complete unknown. But I think that um, this is actually a disadvantage because the figure is surrounded by prejudgments, as is Freud. People think they know what Freud is about. They've never read a word of Freud. They have no idea that he's for example, one of the great stylists of German, that he's an absolute pleasure to read, and that his personality bristles on the page. You feel like you're with someone very learned, very wise, very generous when you read Freud. Nobody would assume that when all you know about Freud is a few slogans or theories. But we're here to talk about Jung, and I think the way I would introduce Jung historically to a culture that thinks it already knows who he is I'd say a couple things. I'd go back to his earliest beginnings and some disclaimers, maybe. He is not Freud's follower. He was never Freud's follower. His psychology is not built on Freud's psychology. It was already well underway before he met Freud. They became very close. Freud, the senior figure, and Jung, the up and rising star medical researcher. But it's important to underscore, and scholars of Jung know this, that Jung had his whole program on the way. He was already a researcher of the unconscious, in some respects, better positioned than Freud before they met each other. He was a medical researcher working at the Bergolzli Hospital in Zurich at the turn of the 20th century. That's a very famous hospital, one of the pioneer psychiatric hospitals in Europe. To give you a sense of how famous it is, the director of that institute, uh, Eugen Bleuler, coined the term schizophrenia. Jung was working with him, working with schizophrenics. And another contrast with Freud. Freud worked with wealthy young women who were having neurotic difficulties in Vienna. Uh, he wasn't a professor. He was never really accepted by the academic profession. Jung was a medical researcher working with the severely mentally ill, the hopeless cases in Zurich. And he was reading Freud at the time, but primary tradition, his primary interpretive framework was not coming out of Vienna and Freudian psychoanalysis. It was coming out of Paris, French depth psychology. Psychoanalysis is Freud's term. French depth psychology, we could call it that. Some forgotten figures, and they're very interesting for you and your following because they lead to Schelling. So behind Jung is Pierre Janet, who was as famous as Freud when Freud was making a name for himself in Vienna, but was quickly eclipsed by Freud. Janet, a researcher of the unconscious, of mental illness, working in Paris. And associated with Janet is French philosophy at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, particularly Bergson, who was an enormous figure who had a philosophy of the unconscious. And behind Bergson and Janet, other figures less well known, but increasingly on the radar of Schelling scholars, Félix Ravesson and Victor Cousin behind him. And of course, through that lineage, we get to Schelling. There's obviously other important French researchers there, Maine de Biran being one of them, probably more important to this tradition than Schelling. But the connection with Schelling is something that I think worth underscoring because there has been so much thinking about Schelling and Freud and Schelling and Lacan and the Schelling contribution to the Freudian unconscious tradition. Well, we're missing something else here. This other tradition is connected to things like animal magnetism, to multiple personality disorders as they were examined there seemed to be an outbreak of multiple personality disorders at the end of the 19th century. There's a kind of curious Foucaultian thing that goes on. As we name an illness, they start to proliferate. So now there's schizophrenics everywhere. Well, then there was multiple personalities everywhere. And this is Jung was working on when he began to read Freud. And he was working on it in this French context. So there's a lot that could be said about this French context, but there's a couple points I would like to make about it in terms of introducing Jung. One is that in this context, the unconscious is not primarily reactive. That is, it is not built up through a series of traumas and neurotic episodes. It is primarily productive. It is the base of the personality. And this base is pluralistic. It's composed of multiplicity, a multiplicity which in a normal, healthy individual is the key to the personality. But because we are all vulnerable to illness, it can also split apart into an unmanageable diversity. And this is what Jung was studying at Bergolzli. The other point I would make about this tradition, and this goes to Pierre Janet in particular, is that psychic energy, the idea that there is a kind of energy in the psyche that's analogous to the energy in nature, some kind of continuum of force, if you could say. Obviously, a theme that you find in Freud as well, and it's a big theme in Jung. For Janet and for Jung, this psychic energy is not determined. It becomes determined in application, but it doesn't originate in a determinate way. And this is what made them both, Janet and Jung, so hostile or resistant is the right word to Freud's sexual theory. Because for Freud, the psychic energy is originally sexually determined, not genitally, but in the pre-Oedipal stage of human development with mother attachment. Uh, this is Freud's so-called pansexualism, and it is the place where Jung and Freud parted company. So what Jung would say would be that psychic energy is determined sexually, certainly, but it's also determined religiously and artistically. And when it is so determined artistically or religiously, it is not a kind of recanalization of sexual energy into a different direction. It's a different application of an originally non-determined energy. So in short, art is not sublimated sexuality, nor is religion some kind of expression of repression of infantile sexual desire. Both those theories are standard classical Freudian theories. So he got in touch with Freud because Freud was just developing his theory shortly after Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams, and they hit it off big time. Freud was looking for a successor. Jung was looking for a father. They found each other. A very close relationship began that could not possibly be maintained, and it ended extremely badly with the two of them more or less, well, Freud more than Jung, more or less just breaking it off and saying there's no reason for us to continue talking to each other. But before this break, they were so close that they traveled together to North America on a boat to be lecturers at a university in the US, and they analyzed each other's dreams as they went. So an extremely close relationship. After the break with Freud, Jung had a bit of a mental breakdown. So this would have been around the time of the First World War. And at the same time, he had the dubious fortune, the dubious good luck of marrying one of the richest women in Europe. So he suddenly became extremely wealthy, and he no longer needed to work. And this is a mixed blessing. And so finding himself now ostracized by the psychoanalytical community for his break with Freud over sexuality and not needing to work, he began to fall apart and spent time watching himself falling apart because he spent his early part of his career watching other people fall apart. Well, why couldn't he watch himself fall apart? And he used his considerable artistic skills to give expression to his personality as it came to pieces. And that is where we get the Red Book, which is, I think, well known now. It's Freud, Jung's book of visions and dreams. We see in it like a extraordinary kind of output of imaginative work. There's mythical figures in there and fantastic mandala paintings, and it all looks like something that has more in common with J.R. Tolkien and James Joyce than it does with psychology. But there it is. So after the First World War, his practice really got underway, and he became the founder of a school, and the rest is history. By the time the baby boomers found him, you know, Joseph Campbell and God knows who else. He attained guru status, and people like Hermann Hesse went to be analyzed by him, and so on. The other thing about that's interesting about him is how opposed the reception is. So in the first half of the 20th century, he was regarded with great respect by philosophers, theologians, and psychologists. I'll just give you some names of people who have written on him and referred to him as an authority in certain matters. Gaston Bachelard, Henri Corbet, Paul Tillich, Mircea Eliade. Now these figures are all early 20th century, and it's in dramatic contrast to the second half of the 20th century when he is routinely ridiculed and called a charlatan, and people who do any work in it are dismissed as New Age or something like that. And we have to ask the question, what happened? And I think the answer is postmodernity happened. That is, late nominalism happened. Foucault, Derrida, Lacan happened. And with them, this orthodoxy that words do not refer to things, they just refer to other words. And the only advantage one set of discourses has, or one discourse would have over another, is its power to influence. So it becomes pure ideological warfare in the human sciences. And I think that in such a context, Jung looks like a hopeless naive. Their rejection underscores an important point that Jung is a Platonist.
How does Jung get related to Christianity? How does Christianity figure into his thought and psychoanalysis?
It's a great question. So there's a lot of interest in it these days, and he had a lot to say about it. He wrote a great deal on the psychology of religion, and almost most of it has to do with Christianity and the figure of Christ. That is not because he was a believer. In fact, he wasn't. It's another great prejudice. Right? We all think that Jung is sort of blinkered by his religion. He actually doesn't believe in any particular religion, or if he had a religious view, he does have a religious view. It's much closer to something like Vedanta than it is to Orthodox Christianity. Nevertheless, his interest in Christianity is undeniable. And that's because he decided at a certain point that if he was to be a psychologist of the collective unconscious, once again, that is not an original theory. The original theory is the developmental personal unconscious of Freud's. All the theories of the unconscious, as you know, Chris, in the 19th century were collectivist. So just to give some big ticket names, Schopenhauer's, Hegel's, Schelling's, Kant's, if you want to include him, Fichte's. Everybody, it seemed, in the 19th century believed that the point of the unconscious was to find this collective root at the base of individual personalities. It is Freud who severed the link between one psyche and the other, and he did it for positivist reasons. So that was a parenthetical statement. So he was going to be the researcher of the collective unconscious, but you can't just research the collective unconscious of humanity. He needed to go, like every PhD student, he needed to reduce down to something manageable. And so he decided he would do his work on the unconscious, the Western European unconscious, and therefore psychology of Christianity. Because, first of all, and this is another important point, the collective unconscious is historically differentiated. It's not just one big human soup into which we can dip and pick whatever symbol we like. There is something called a Western European unconscious. This is also, by the way, how he got into trouble with anti-Semitism, because he also argued that there is a distinctively Jewish unconscious, and that is something that Freud was speaking to. He didn't mean there's something inferior about the Jewish unconscious. He just said it's a different unconscious. And somehow I think Freud would probably have even agreed. Think about Freud's work on religion, Moses and monotheism. He would work on the psychology of European collective unconscious, which would be Christian. So why Christian? Because Christianity is a psychological fact. So it now dwells in our unconscious, shows up in our dreams, in our symbols, in our movies, in our novels, and this is an obvious point. We all have no trouble seeing a Christ image, let's say in Del Toro's new Frankenstein film. And there's nothing arbitrary or out of place about such an image. And we don't take it to mean that Del Toro is promoting the Christian gospel. It's just part of our symbolic lexicon. So Christianity is a psychological fact, or Christianity has become unconscious for us. Elsewhere, somewhere he says, in time, the whole Christian church will dwell in the unconscious, particularly in a secular age, in a disenchanted age, in a post-church age. All of that symbolism, which was so dominating our political and intellectual and cultural life for over a millennia, doesn't evaporate because we've discovered some features of science that put it into question, or we become evolutionary theorists, or we become decolonial thinkers. It can't disappear. So it takes up its residency in the unconscious. And it's in that regard that Jung is a Christian, a thinker of Christianity. But for him, Christ is not particularly, significant in terms of the history of the world. He's an archetype. So he's exactly analogous to the Buddha.
I asked you that question because for the viewers that don't know this, Sean has a podcast as well, an unbelievable podcast with a Jungian psychoanalyst called The Secular Christ, which is just fantastic, and I highly recommend it. You can find it on YouTube, and it's just wonderful. And he goes, and Dr. McGrath goes through many of these issues that we're discussing right now. And I think his name is Jakob, right? Jakob is
Jakob
another,
Luschensky, yeah.
yeah, who's also excellent as well too on that. So thank you so much for that. We'll be now transitioning to a discussion on your forthcoming book from Cascade Publication in 2027, The Soul of Nature on the Unconscious and Related Matters. And I actually have the opportunity to read the introduction. Sean has been so kind to send it to me. We'll kind of be going through. And so we go way back. We're going to take a flashback now to your graduate self at the University of Toronto in a graduate seminar. And what I loved about this introduction is the beginning of when you say that you like to be provoked into thought, and that not in the Hegelian sense of the kind of dialectical provocation, but Socratic dialogue. And this provocation that you start off with is between essence and existence. And a claim that Heidegger states that this goes back to Aristotle, and you, being a good graduate student and reader of Aquinas and let's say the early church fathers and the Neoplatonic and Christian traditions, knew that no, 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 this is not correct, that this starts with the Christian tradition. So maybe we can begin with this distinction, this first movement, this first provocation with Heidegger
Hmm.
and essence and existence.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. First, I would just correct. I don't enjoy this feature of myself. I seem to need to be provoked into thought, and it's not a pleasant experience, and it hasn't always led to my success because I did something that I now tell all doctoral students not to do. Do not write on a figure critically. That is, do not write on somebody you think is wrong, because for a very simple reason, you will end up without a reception. Your dissertation is received by the community of people who are enthusiastic about the figure that you're writing about. It's not going to be received by a group of people who are critical of the figure that you're writing about because there is no such community. So I ended up more or less um, persona non grata. That's too dramatic. I was not that important enough. Someone whose book on Heidegger really didn't need a great deal of attention from Heideggerians. But back to this story about the provocation. Yeah, so I had been reading, I was a reader of Gilson, almost forgotten French historian of philosophy, and I knew that there was something different about medieval thought and ancient thought, and that the essence existence distinction was at the core of it. It's even better than this being a Christian contribution, it's actually a Muslim contribution. That the first to really make this distinction in the sense in which it is so determinative of medieval thought is Avicenna in the ninth century, in order to distinguish the being of God from the being of creatures. And then it gets picked up by Aquinas and the Latin Aristotelians, and then more or less becomes a kind of staple of Thomistic thinking and Catholic theology, that in everything that exists, there is a composition of essence and existence, which means that the thing need not exist. Its existence is added to it. But in God, there is no such composition. It's a real fundamental distinction. It's what people mean by the analogy of being, that there are these two quite different orders of being. They should not be confused with one another. You shouldn't impose the categories. It's the original ontological difference. What Heidegger says, and by the way, Heidegger knew all this stuff. He was trained in Aristotelian scholasticism. So it's something deeply disingenuous about Heidegger, which I don't think anybody would be surprised to hear. So when Heidegger says, we have categories that apply to things, and we have existentials that apply to Dasein, and this is the ontological difference. Well, there is an older difference, which would say we have categories, discursive concepts, which apply to essence existence composition, which has created beings, but they do not apply on this other level, this apophatic level, where we deal with actual infinity or the incomprehensible simplicity of God. So it's a really crucial distinction. And in this core, in basic problems of phenomenology, Heidegger says he's well underway now trying to destroy Jewish Christian thinking and root it out of the canon. And he says that this distinction was well known to Aristotle. Um, and because and the point there being, of course, there's nothing important was contributed by medieval thinkers. It was well known to Aristotle, but he didn't make a big deal of it, and properly so. It was the Thomists or the medieval thinkers who made a big deal of it because they were trying to prove speciously that the world was created, and they just took us entirely down the wrong path, further down the road towards the absolute forgetfulness of being. So I didn't know what he was really talking about with forgetfulness of being and all these other things, but I certainly couldn't believe that he was saying that. So I said, I've got to figure out what's at the bottom of this, and then I got a day stipendium to research Heidegger and Freiburg, and discovered that in fact this was not just a one-off, but this man had been more or less groomed by the Catholic Church to be a defender of the Aristotelian scholastic ideal, as he put it himself, um, and somebody who had written uh, his second dissertation on Duns Scotus. He knew exactly what he was talking about here, but we were not getting the full story. We're getting a kind of typical Heideggerian destructive reading of the history, which is going to bring our attention to features of the history which he thinks are important or which have not been thought through. So that was the provocation there, and yeah, that was the first book.
Through this connection with Heidegger and overcoming Heidegger as the Luther of metaphysics. I really, really love that line. I think that's
That's his own.
amazing.
I think that's his own phrase, or is it his phrase or another commenter on him? He fashioned himself a Luther of metaphysics. John Van Buren said it. Anyway, he was deep. He immersed himself in Luther while he was writing Being and Time. Not something you would expect.
No, not something you would expect at
And what
all.
what, what you see in Luther is this de-Hellenization program. That is, so it's working on the other side, on the theology side, both Heidegger and Luther recognizing that medieval thought, Christendom, is a fusion of the Hellenistic and the Hebraic, a system or a synthesis. And Luther, on his side, trying to free theology from the Greek element by destroying it down to its origins. And Heidegger, on the philosophical side, trying to free philosophy, which in its origins is Greek, from the Jewish Christian element. But the thing I wanted to say about his unbelief, it was not quite as negative as you put it. I wanted to say something more to the effect that an unbeliever has their own legitimate reading of the
Right.
history of philosophy. It will be one-sided. It will be distortive in some respects, but illuminative in others. And the same generosity should go towards the believer, that the believer will also have their own legitimate approach to the history of philosophy. It will be one-sided. It will be to some degree distortive and to some degree illuminative. And this gets back to the point that we were talking about earlier, that we are all in this together, and nobody has the privileged access point from which they can survey all of these meta narratives and set them one against each other and give them pros and cons and scores and so on. And if you add onto this the theory of historically differentiated collective unconsciousness, you suddenly see we don't even have that kind of freedom with respect to our own traditions. We will, in some respects, be the worst readers. We're the worst critics of our own traditions because we are so enmeshed in them in some respects. So it's more of a equalizing the playing field. And since there is no question that unbelief is more welcome in academia than belief, my argument there is more to say, well, let's go all the way with your postmodern plurality and make sure that the theological voice is represented as well.
This relationship with Heidegger and revelation, it leads you to interpreting you call the romantic psychologists, which by the way, I never knew. I know of Karras and Fechner. I know of Fechner because of Deleuze, actually. But Kerner and Schubert, I had really no understanding of. I didn't even know who they were. So Maybe we can begin by talking about the psychologies of the unconscious and your relationship to psychodynamic psychology.
Sure. So you do know who Schubert is because he was the one who um, invited Schelling to Erlangen to give his Erlangen lectures. He was Schelling's very close follower. You could call him his disciple and a Naturphilosoph. So you've heard of him at least. Well, you know who he is indirectly, and I believe he also was involved in the Stuttgart seminars. Um, yeah. Anyway, but I might be mistaken on that, but certainly Erlangen, he was the one who invited him to Erlangen. Yeah. So the point there is that there was a second provocation, as you know, which was sometime around 2006, reading Zizek's Indivisible Remainder on Schelling and Other Matters. And so I'm deliberately entitling the book, um, I'm echoing him in the book title, on the unconscious and related matters because of the importance of that book for provoking me, because it gave what seemed to me to be the mistaken interpretation of Schelling as supporting Lacanian post-structuralism. And so that was that provocation that led to the dark ground of spirit. So and once again, the old German Academy was great. They would, there was nothing too esoteric for them. They would fund it if it looked like a legitimate topic. Didn't matter if it was politically trending or not. And so I certainly wasn't politically trending. I think my topic for the Humboldt was um, the esoteric origins of psychoanalysis and 19th century thought or something like that. It was a really convoluted thing. And so, but I wanted to show that there was this, there was a context to Schelling's thinking about the unconscious and it wasn't Lacanian. And so, I went down a rabbit hole and I found myself discovering this whole century of psychodynamic thought, which was the 19th century. And it wasn't just a few figures, there were many figures. There were societies founded, there were journals published. Schelling's own brother was a major contributor to animal magnetism. So there was a lot going on. And many of these figures were in discussion with Schelling. For example, you certainly know the little psychological treatise embedded in the Stuttgart seminars, where Schelling gives a tripartite structure of the soul. Well, that's in direct discussion with psychiatrists at the time who are reading Schelling, but they're working in the medical context. And there's a back and forth going on about what the nature of the soul is and how desire is at the root of the personality. And so there's nothing arbitrary or invented or constructed about these categories. So this 19th century romantic psychology is we talked about it a bit because the French line goes right back into it. It's theories of productive unconsciousness, not reactive unconsciousness, and it's very much connected to naturphilosophy because it is motivated to correct the fallacy of dualism, the Cartesian split. And the way they propose to correct this split is by finding, and this will sound very familiar, a common ground to these two apparent opposites of mind and matter. But that common ground would not simply be mind as we know it, nor would it be matter as we experience it. It would be unconscious. It would be unconscious spirit. And so spirit in some slumbering form, as Hegel put it in his philosophy of mind. Incidentally, that is a great. Hegel's anthropology is a treasure trove of this lost, forgotten romantic psychology. So that's what. So Schelling was working on the unity of mind and nature, on the synergy between culture, symbolism, language, human thought, and non-human life, animal thinking, the life of plants, and so on. And Zizek, in his brilliant way, tries to convince us of exactly the opposite. Because for Jacques Lacan, the post-structuralists, there is no unconscious in nature. Animals don't have an unconscious. The unconscious is purely a problem of a Cartesian subject. Lacan is a Cartesian. Zizek says as much. This is not some kind of deep continuity of humanity with nature. It's on the contrary, the sign of the gulf, unbridgeable chasm that forever separates us from nature and creates all of this longing and ideological fantasy about ourselves and our relationship to our bodies and so on. And the psychoanalyst is the one who, recognizing this sort of tragic quality of human existence, we are deeply absurd, according to Lacan. Or as Zizek puts it in that essay, Unbehagen in der Natur, we don't belong in nature. So the work of the psychoanalyst is to help this constitutively neurotic animal with its inescapable neuroses and to help them accept their neuroses because the only alternative to neurosis is psychosis. But the psychotic is in a curious way more honestly responsive to the absurdity of the situation, to the horrific meaninglessness of nature. So somehow Schelling is in support of this view. How is that possible? And so I provoked into thought. I found myself researching what Schelling really was reading and thinking about when he wrote about the unconscious. And I discovered not only romantic psychology, but speculative pietism, Friedrich Christoph Oetinger, Jakob Böhme, all your friends, and their fascinating theories about life, about living nature, and about the soul as, if not the pinnacle of nature, the center point, the place where nature becomes articulate, representing itself to itself. Mental illness would should be explained in terms of the function, the organic role that the soul plays in the economy of the universe. And similarly, the dynamics of personality, how our personality develops over time, because we are living things, we are an organism, and our soul is living. It will be, to some degree, explicable in terms of natural drives and natural dynamisms like attraction and repulsion and so on and so on and so on, as Zizek would put it. So exactly not Zizek's Schelling. Now, Zizek is so good. He recognizes this, and he says as much in the indivisible remainder, that there is this sort of split in Schelling, that Schelling, in one respects is kind of supporting this new agey kind of uh, balance of nature talk that the Jungians promote. But because Schelling is so good, he starts to write things he himself doesn't understand. And so in kind of frenzy during the Weltalter period in particular, he can no longer maintain the fantasy, the romantic fantasy, and begins to give articulation to the truth of the situation. So what Zizek is doing in the indivisible remainder is he's psychoanalyzing Schelling. He's not the Weltalter and the freedom essay. He's not looking to see what Schelling might have had in mind or means in his context, but rather what Schelling is saying in spite of himself. The solution is already in place. There is no question that Lacan is right and that the soul is the Cartesian subject adrift in a meaningless world. That's already set up long before he cracks open Schelling. So the question is only to see to what degree Schelling is in alignment or not with this truth, this horrific Gnostic truth, really, of our situation.
This provocation with Zizek, which I think is extremely fantastic, it leads to your wonderful text, The Dark Ground of Spirit, which was a huge motivator in my reading of Schelling, and I know a lot of other people's reading in Schelling. And it led you to people like Agrippa, and of course, Nicholas of Cusa, and all of these wonderful thinkers, Boehme. And then we get to this figure that is not so well known, Frederick Christoph Oetinger, who that you call a vanishing mediator.
Yeah.
Why is Oetinger this vanishing mediator, and how does he relate to Jung, the unconscious, and
Mm.
even mature philosophy?
I think there's three pieces written on Oettinger in English, and I think I wrote one of them. Well, I know I wrote one of them. There's very little written about this figure in English. And in Germany, it's of course different, but even in Germany, it's very niche. So Oettinger it was a contemporary of Kant's and Southern German. He started as a philosopher, deeply immersed in Leibniz and Wolff, as all the Germans were at that time. But he eventually became a pastor in the Pietist tradition. He was also a scientist, which wasn't unusual at the time. So there was that kind of polymath model. So he conducted experiments in alchemy and so on, and a reader of the Kabbalah, a very erudite man. But he belonged at the center of a specific form of pietism. So we know how important pietism was for German philosophy. Nietzsche is not wrong when he says that all the German philosophers were the sons of pastors, and these pastors were all pietists. And for people who don't have any connection with pietism, just think of evangelical Christianity in North America, and you'll have an analogy to pietism. It emphasized the heart, the individual's response to Jesus. It was anti-clerical, uh, very much opposed to Catholicism and all that hierarchical mediated Christianity. It was emotional, affective, um, probably guilty of a bit of irrationalism to some degree. You can clearly see why it's the grandfather of Romanticism in a certain way. But in this particular sect of speculative pietism, which includes another figure named Philipp Matthias Hahn, who's directly connected to Schelling, there was a kind of imperative that it wouldn't be enough simply to respond to Jesus in your heart. You needed to somehow engage the culture, not necessarily to convert them, that would be great, but at least to correct the fallacies, and particularly the fallacies of mechanistic science, of rationalism coming out of Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, of a kind of growing kind of godless view of nature. And so Oettinger is he's a spearhead, he spearheads this. And he makes major contributions in this regard. He's got I think his collected works are 70 volumes. And his argument is extremely interesting, particularly for Schellingians, because once you get familiar with Oettinger, you simply see him all over Schelling, particularly the early and the middle Schelling. His argument is that we got into this quagmire of mechanism and godless nature. We got here because we made a mistake theologically, and it's probably the medievals who made the mistake, but we've compounded it by repeating it in secular contexts. We came to think that the proper name of God is being, when in fact the proper name of God in the scriptures is life. God is life. He is eternal life. And that leads to a completely different set of categories. So dynamism, the play of forces, internal productive opposition, um, a drive, an exteriorizing drive, an internalizing drive, a God that moves in a certain way, a God whose image is also living, moving, dynamic, internally diversified, never simply efficiently caused or never reducible to efficient causes, but teleological, finally caused, final causal, um, and not just in certain exceptional instances, as Kant would say. Well, we have this funny little object here which wiggles and seems to have its own life, so we need to make a teleological judgment about it, but can't be objective. Rather, in the whole of the universe is alive as the image of God, and this living universe produces not just living matter, but living souls like our own. And so our own soul needs to be understood in this biodynamic way. Uh, so little Schelling was probably reading Oettinger when he was 10 years old. Um, he certainly knew Philipp Matthias Hahn was because he studied he went to grammar school in Nürtingen, where he stayed with his uncle, and his uncle was a follower of Hahn. So but it wasn't just Schelling, it was also Hegel. and Hölderlin, the Tübingen trio, they were all children of speculative pietist families. And you suddenly realize this, and you you suddenly take this historical context to their work, and certain things become absolutely plain to see. So no, it isn't just from rationalism to Scottish empiricism to German idealism, this incoherent story we tell in the history of philosophy. There is an important theological mediation without which German idealism couldn't have occurred. So just take, for example, Hegel. The notion, if you have a close look at the system, the encyclopedia, the notion is life. That's what it is. So at the end of the logic, the notion achieves its initial consummation in the organism. And the organism is the material analog of spirit, self-mediating spirit, this act of self-mediation or negotiation of internal diversity or identification of the identical and the different. This is the dynamic of the living thing. You can see it, you can read it in Oettinger. Of course, Oettinger's sources are as interesting as Oettinger himself. So it's the Kabbalah, which he can read along with the Greek fathers and the Latin fathers. And it's, of course, Jakob Böhme, of whom he's extremely enthusiastic. So Oettinger is the Boehmian of the 18th century, just as Schelling is the Boehmian of the 19th century, or Schelling and Bader compete for that title, but Bader's corpus is difficult. So Schelling sort of gets the title just for visibility. So he's a vanishing mediator because he's simply unreceived. And the difficulty, of course, will remain that while we have this prejudice that we started with, while we assume that there is something that privileges unbelief in the academic world and disprivileges belief, we will not read these sources because Oettinger is entirely a theologian. He has there's no Recurrian dance around of an unbelieving discourse safe for the atheist community. Yeah, and therefore we don't read Schelling correctly. So the freedom essay, for example, the word life occurs 50 times in the freedom essay. If you look at it, at the freedom essay, and you ask the question, so he's writing about freedom and he starts with this birth of God. Why is he talking about the birth of God? He's talking about the birth of God because he's talking about the exemplar of life. Because freedom is life. Freedom is the highest expression of life. Life is free. Life is spontaneous. It's autopoietic. It produces itself. It's not efficiently causally pushed from behind. And so if we want to talk about the free soul, the human being, we need to speak about it as the apogee of life itself. And then the best way to think that, of course, is to think it in its eternal exemplar, the life of God. God is the living God. And now everything comes into focus then. The problems with Spinoza, for example, shared by Hegel and Schelling, and the proximity of Schelling and Hegel on this point, so that we can begin to see what the difference is. They both agree that spirit is the fullest expression of life, and life is internally differentiated, dynamic, spontaneous, self-generative. So once we see that that's all in place, that agreement's all in place, you can get more precise about what the differences are.
Jung as the last nature philosopher. Why is Jung a nature philosopher and what is his relationship with nature?
So that is actually not my claim. That was Antoine Febvre, who was the professor at the University of Paris, recently deceased, and who more or less founded the field of Western esotericism. So the interdisciplinary field that would study things like Kabbalah, Hermeticism, uh, things like that. And in the Dictionary of Western Esotericism, and I think it's called the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism, something like that. A big fat book, really excellent book. There's an entry on Jung, and Febvre writes it, and Febvre says he's the last Naturphilosoph. I think I said somewhere in there that might have been a premature because I know a couple others who are still alive. But it's an extremely interesting recontextualization of the figure. And for me, it makes immense sense because Jung, the first thing that you need to realize about Jung is that he is not a systematic thinker. He's not even a particularly gifted writer. I don't think that was really his calling. My suspicion is that Jung was an oral teacher and that his reputation cannot be explained on the basis of his writings. It has to be based on something else. It has to be based on his personality and the way he worked with people and his yeah. And you can also see that in his writing. It's always very like the collected works we know that the collected works were assembled to look like the standard edition of Freud to make Jung look more systematic than he was, and that these pieces are all pulled from here and there, different context, and a talk he's invited to give somewhere, and an essay that he writes and then revises 50 years later. So it's all this kind of scattered material. But there are certain recurring themes, and one of them would be this productive unconsciousness, that the unconscious is not just reactive and doesn't just make us sick, or it's not just a symptom of the sick. It is actually a place of inspiration. It's where art comes from. It's forward looking. This is really a crucial thing. So life is teleological. Everybody knows that. Even those who believe there is no such thing as life, like maybe Kant, says it's teleological. That is, it's anticipatory, it's forward looking, that little thing breaking, that little sprout finding its way through the earth is acting propulsively. It's looking for the sun. It's not just being pushed by, you know, some molecular reactions in the seed, but it's on its way somewhere. And this is a key theme in Jungian analysis, that the soul is on its way somewhere. The soul is future oriented, or you will say finalistic, because he's afraid of getting metaphysical rather than teleological. But it means essentially the same thing. And the point here is that the soul is alive and it's living and it's developing and it's not at the end of its journey yet. And so its problems will be developmental problems that should be explained in terms of its life, that is, its end goal. And this is strikingly in contrast to Freud, who is mechanistic on the question of life and is following a kind of Darwinian orthodoxy about mechanism, so that the soul is not going anywhere for Freud. It's just managing, the extremely difficult situation of being a conscious being in modernity under the conditions of modernity. So when you go to a Freudian analysis, you talk about your past almost immediately, especially your infantile past, your pre-egoic, your pre-verbal childhood, because the assumption is that your difficulties that you're having today are in every way causally affected by these unresolved traumas of your past. You're basically an efficient causal mechanism. When you go into a Jungian analysis, you'll also talk about your present issues, and you might talk about the past, but always with a view to where you're going. Like, what's coming up for you? What is it about your current life, what new thing occurring in your life right now is making it difficult for you to adapt? So this is where I got the concept of productive dissociation. That's exactly what I meant by it. So that there are certain kinds of dissociations or breaks with our situation, which are not reactive and pathological, but they're necessary for growth. So a classic example would be puberty, that one needs to break with one's childhood and go into some new thing because you're being called into a situation, sexuation and maturity, for which your past has not really prepared you. And so there's all kinds of struggles around puberty. It's a very mentally fragile time, as I'm sure we all remember. But that's just the most dramatic example. Jung said that these kinds of growing pains accompany people right to the end of their life. He was particularly interested with people in the second half of life and even old people who are facing death, because he saw that this productive dissociation was constantly at work in them, that their mental health issues were usually explicable in terms of a kind of resistance to some new thing that life, which is ever forward moving, is demanding of them. So instead of rising to the occasion, dropping the old pattern and growing, a new habit, developing a new habit to deal with the new situation, you reconstellate or you reawaken a complex. And then fantasy takes over, and you begin to talk to your boss as though he's your dad, or you begin to act like you're a 25-year-old frat boy when you're 45 years old and married. These are kind of funny examples, but I think we can see the point here. Something that belongs in the past is now, we could say, you know, very Schellingianly, uncannily actual in the present. And it's uncannily actualized in the present. And Schelling actually speaks exactly this way in the Weltalter. It's uncannily actualized in the present because the soul is not rising to the occasion of the dissociation from the past that it's called to, or it's negatively dissociating. It's dissociating from the dissociation life is demanding of it. And so you get this model of an ever-growing life, which is the soul. And it's and how difficult life is, and time is, and growth is, and how it never particularly stops. And most importantly, how we never really at no point in our human life do we get there. Now, you could, at this point, belief, which is invited into the room, nominalism and Gnostic Lacanianism is right into the room. You can say, exactly, it never gets there because it's absurd. And its absurdity produces fantasy. And so the big other shows up, and all of this narration and identity formation in order to resist the horrible truth that we're going nowhere. And then my answer would be, how do you know, Dr. Lacan, where we're going? And that it amounts to nowhere. Did you come back from the dead? Were you the first to have a peek behind the veil to see that it's nothing? There's a kind of certainty there that I think is questionable from a purely secular standpoint. And Jung, being one of these secular thinkers, finds that is premature. That is a premature decision. That the soul is constantly looking forward means that there's quite good reason to think that the major world religions were correct. That there is a life after death. There's plenty of empirical evidence that a lot of people believe that, and now we have evidence that the soul seems to be structured around that. At one point, Jung says, I don't know if there's life after death, but I know it's good for people to believe there is. It makes them healthy. Um, so individuation is something that takes more than the life we've got, as though we are little shoots of eternal life, just growing accustomed to living forever or something like that.
Part of the introduction, um, you try to venture a synthesis between Jung, um, Lacan, and Botter, um, in reinterpreting God, nature, and the meaning of life. And I'm assuming this synthesis is occurring in order to like beat off the kind of disenchantment we have with the world.
I'm a thinker of disenchantment. I'm on the side of the disenchanters, but that's a conversation for another time. But you know that because you looked at thinking nature. So
Yes.
the re-enchantment agenda, unless it depends on what it means. There's different meanings of re-enchantment, but there's certainly some predominant meanings of re-enchantment that I'm not interested in. And a lot of that re-enchantment talk has misunderstood Jung, because Jung is a psychologist of the disenchanted.
Yeah.
Jung says openly that the Catholics don't need psychoanalysis. They got the church. They have a symbol system that's working for them. Psychoanalysis for the unchurched secular person who the first human being in human history to have no myth to live by. So he's a psychologist of the disenchanted world. But what I was getting at there was, so we have this, and it's a perfect question. Thank you, Chris. Your questions are always so good. So we have this very positive outlook for this eternal, this immortal soul individuating maybe beyond this life. And it's all very affirmative and hopeful. And this can become, let's say, naive to the impediments to our existence, which are not just natural. Now I'm thinking about the problem of evil. I'm thinking of the question of sin. I'm thinking of the self that cannot help itself. I'm thinking about the naivete of so much self-help language. I'm thinking of the fact that bad people seem to do really well in this world. I'm thinking of the fact that good people sometimes just get creamed. They don't get rewarded, even by nature. I'm thinking of the fact that our unconscious doesn't only forwardly look towards life, but it seems to actively produce death. Uh, and all of this, I want to think about it in a theological context because it is the problem of sin. You know, people think that the problem of evil is an objection to Christianity. In fact, the problem of evil is a proof for Christianity. If there was no problem of evil, there would be no need for a crucified Savior. So, Christians, Catholics in particular, were reading Jung in the 20th century, and they were seeing something naively humanistic here, and rightly so, and pushing back. So, what I'm doing with this last essay is I'm somewhat sneakily using Lacanian nihilism as a check on Jungian optimistic humanism to make a case for a more Catholic psychoanalysis, such as maybe Franz von Baader would offer us, in which we would say something that Thomas Aquinas would fully agree with, that we are anticipating something wonderful. We are naturally headed towards something um, fulfilling and eternal life, and yet we have no natural capacity to reach that end. That is exactly what Aquinas says in his treatise on happiness, that we anticipate human fulfillment as something far beyond sense gratification, and yet we have no natural capacity to fulfill ourselves. So, from a certain perspective, we are the most misfortunate of all animals. Other animals don't have this problem. Their natural ends are naturally fulfillable by them. Not so in the situation of the human being. Nur ein Gott kann uns retten. Only Nur Gott kann uns retten. Only God can save us. That is, without grace, um, perhaps Lacan is right. Uh, but there is grace, so he's wrong. But so too is Jung in a certain way, in as much as he thinks that this is something that we can achieve on our own. So I think the very last section of the book is called Unitas Sola Gratia, because Jung talks a great deal about conjunctio and the unification of the conflicting parts of the self in some kind of almost theosis, individuation moment. And that's what we image for us. That's what the Buddha image means. That's what the Christ image means. And this somehow is to be achieved naturally, maybe with the help of expensive analysis. And I want to say no, without grace, it's not going to happen. But the good news is that it does happen. And once again, if we have an unblinkered reading of history, we'll see that it's happened often. There are a lot of examples of a graceful individuation.
What is involved in this Jungian rehabilitation? This is my last question. Sorry.
Mm. Well, I think it's pretty simple. We just have to start reading him instead of acting as though we have read him, and uh, reclaim him for the corpus of Western thought. And so that's part of what the book is about. So the last three, a good half of the book is on Jung, and these many of these pieces started as chapters of the Dark Ground of Spirit, but I didn't include them along with a lot of the other esoteric stuff. So the rehabilitation is just about a bit of plurality in the discussion about psychology, and there is now lots of impetus coming from different directions for this. For example, teleology is making a comeback in evolutionary theory, rather significant one. The hard problem of consciousness didn't go away. Uh, Reductionism seems to be dead in the water in physics, in biology, in chemistry. So it's almost as though the hard sciences are already well underway towards rereading the canon, while we in philosophy are still working with the assumption that the mechanical reductionist scientific view is final and determinative of what's true and what's false about the world. We're back there with Sellers. So we need to kind of recognize that that many questions are open now. And some of Schelling's contributions, especially his early nature philosophy, is becoming extremely relevant in this context because he was trying to do something similar, that is, overcome mechanism and in such a way as to understand the soul as natural, as the soul of nature, that is nature's soul. And there's a play on word, the play on the genitive there. Nature comes to some kind of self-consciousness in us, and but also nature itself is ensouled, is alive. That life is not an exception, but it is the rule in a certain way. And so that there is soul in animals, there is soul in plants, there is soul in solar systems, maybe in some way, strange way. So the epigram of the book is the phrase from Plato's Timaeus. So God created the universe as perfect as he could. He made it a living organism and endowed it with a soul. And I think that we have come to the moment where that doesn't seem to be quite as mythic necessarily as it did in the heyday of positivism and and mechanism. So the reading of Jung is really to bring him, to just give him a spot alongside others. I don't think he's more important than Oetinger, but I think he has an importance now because of his persistence. There's lots of unionism in the world, but it more or less proliferates in the outside the academic world, and that's not always to its benefit, since it gets caught up in self-help and new age and ego psychology, and really he's much more sophisticated than that. And yeah, but there will be other figures that I would be interested in reviving. I am intrigued by the possibility that we are on the cusp of a new age of metaphysics. And it had a start. It had a false start, maybe. A false start in the sense that it didn't really start in the 19th century. And this would be the metaphysics of life. But it became the metaphysics of the subject in the 19th century, even in Schelling in a certain way. Here I must venture a critique that it seems that between Schelling 1 and Schelling 2, um, this transition happens. That Schelling 1 was really tracking the metaphysics of life, and Schelling 2 probably in his bid to correct Hegel offered a metaphysics of the subject. I think Kant is a problem, a very serious problem, because he's so good and he's so wrong. And it seems to me that any philosopher who doesn't recognize that is really not first of all, any philosopher who doesn't recognize his the unavoidability of the Kantian um, paradigm is really not worth reading. Um, but he is so wrong in so many ways about so much. And ultimately, I think I read Kant as a mechanist. I don't see Kant as someone who gives us a metaphysics of life such that we could, with Schweitzer, recognize reverence for life as a universal ethic. I see Kant as actually supporting a very instrumentalist, utilitarian, anthropocentric view of everything. Um, and so I'm interested in this moment that we missed. I think what I was talking about earlier that might have got cut off was that the metaphysics of life was a false start in the 19th century, in the sense that something started that didn't actually take, and that is especially the the earliest Schelling, the Schelling of the Naturphilosophie, of the early Naturphilosophie, not so much the identity philosophy. I'm not so sure about what happens when nature philosophy becomes identity philosophy. I understand, of course, why it happens, but I'm not sure it's a good thing. But the early nature philosophy, when Schelling was really most trying to bring together, let's say, these two parts of his life, the two parts of his upbringing, or the two his two halves of his world, his speculative pietist upbringing and his transcendental philosophical training. And so we began to see something like a metaphysics of life take root, but it becomes the metaphysics of subjectivity, becomes the metaphysics of the subject is in the philosophy of revelation. And it probably did so because he was competing with Hegel, and Hegel did the same thing. The metaphysics, life is really just the negative moment in the development of spirit. So spirit, subjectivity triumphs over life in both these philosophies in such a way as to become something that is genuinely anthropocentric in a problematic sense. So I'm reading a lot of philosophy of biology these days, and I'm very excited to see the return of teleology and natural teleology. Um, and it's happening amazingly in complete ignorance of the 19th century. So I'm excited to see what can happen when these discourses are brought together, when an evolutionary biological thinker with the sophistication of Terence Deacon is brought into contact with the early Schelling, you know. I'm intrigued to see where this can go. I'm kind of hoping to prove Plato correct, that the universe is alive and it has a soul.
Sean, thank you so much for again participating in this series and for sharing your work with all of us. We're all going to be waiting patiently for the release from Cascade Press, The Soul of Nature on the Unconscious and Related Matters